Hello and welcome to another edition of Subversive Radio, and I'm your host, Keith Giles. Here we are. So we're going to continue talking about the Didache. If you did not hear part one, you probably need to, because that's where I explain what the heck a Didache is, where it came from, and what it's all about. But just briefly, what it is the Didache is a first century document. It's a training manual for how to make disciples. And it predates the Gospels that we have in the New Testament Bible. So we're going to look now at the structure of the Didache. And hopefully we'll have time to get into some of the content, maybe beginning in chapter 1. So the Didache does follow a structure which at first may seem, if you just read it, it may just seem to kind of, ramble. It seems at first that it sort of just kind of talks about this a little bit, and then it moves over here and talks about this. It just changes subjects seemingly at random. However, that isn't the case. There actually is a very methodical organizational structure and thread, which if you understand in advance what that structure is, it really could help you understand the document and understand how to read it and how to use it, okay? So we're going to talk about that real briefly. So the organizational thread is this. The Didache is intended to be a comprehensive step-by-step program for someone to use to disciple a Gentile or a pagan, formerly pagan, non-Jewish person to come into the way of Christ and to the Christian faith. And so it's all really about discipleship. And so the Didache, unlike, let's say, 1 Corinthians, for example, it doesn't have topic paragraphs before each chapter to sort of say, okay, here's what we're going to talk about now. But it does sort of begin with some topic sentences or phrases every time it shifts to a new section. Okay, and then what they do, they don't have, as I said, the sort of introductory paragraphs, but they do have sort of summary statements at the end of sections that sort of like after they've told you all the things that they want you to know, they'll wrap everything up in a summary before they shift to the next section. Okay, so if you have a copy of the Didache, which by the way, I'll tell you again, you can search online and you can for free find the entire thing on the internet. What I did was just copy it, paste it, and email it to myself, and then I dropped it into my Notepad application on my iPod. So it's in my pocket at any time. I can just pull it up and read it. So anyway, if you have a copy of the Didache, and it's easy to get one, you'll notice that the Didache is broken into chapters just like any New Testament book. Okay. And these summary statements occur at the end. They occur at the end of the section. So there's a summary statement at the end of the section in chapter 4, verse 14. There are summary statements at the end found at chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and in chapter 15, verse 4. Okay, and there are also they're not really summary statements, but they're sort of warnings or cautions at the end of sections. And those are found in chapter 4, verse 12, chapter 6, verse 1, and chapter 11, verse 1. And again, each of those sections are intended to either summarize or warn disciples. And then they're found at the end of, or it brings closure to the ends of those materials before they move on to the next topic. Okay? If that makes sense. So rather than having introductory paragraphs or sections before they lead into the teaching, they jump straight into the teaching. And then when they're finished with that particular teaching on that particular topic, they'll summarize it or provide final warnings or cautions for those who don't obey this teaching. And then they'll move on to the next section. Okay. So there are basically 5 divisions. The Didache is broken into sort of 5 main sections. Okay. The first section, section 1, of course, begins in chapter 1, verse 1. It goes until chapter 6, verse 2. And that essentially is the training program for the way of life. Okay. The second section begins in 6:3 and goes until chapter 11, verse 2. That second section is all about rules and regulations for baptism, for fasting, for prayer, for the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, for the kinds of foods that they should eat or not eat. Okay, that's the second section. The third section are rules and regulations for hospitality and for testing the kinds of people who might come into your church. In other words, traveling evangelists, traveling apostles, traveling preachers, teachers, etc. And so those are found in chapter 11, verse 3 to all the way to chapter 13, verse 2. Okay. The fourth section, these are rules and regulations for first fruits and offerings and that kind of a thing. That goes from 13.3 to 15.4. And then the fifth and final section is sort of the closing warnings. There's a lot of apocalyptic kind of language, so we'll look at that, as well as not just warnings about the end, about the apocalypse or the return of Christ, but statements of hope. And then that goes from that's found in chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. So the biggest chunk of the Didache really is the very first section. The bulk of it is about the training the disciple to enter the way of life. This is what it means to be into the way of Christ. Okay, that is about 44% of nearly half of the Didache is made up of that first section. And again, that's chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 6, verse 2. Okay, and then the second largest part, and again, that's even before you get to baptism. So this is pre-baptismal, like before you even baptized into the way of Christ formerly. There is a teaching for make sure you understand this is what you're coming into. And once you pass through that first section of training to be a disciple, there's sort of a, I suppose we would call it probably today sort of almost a confirmation that, yes, you are ready to be baptized. And then once you had gone through that first section, then you would be baptized, and then you'd be on to section 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so what else can we say about this section here? So, yeah, I think we've covered that part of it. I think that's probably enough, I think, on the structure. So we actually have plenty of time, I think, to get into the teaching itself in the Didache. So I'm going to pull it up, and then we can begin. Here we go. So the Didache begins, there are two ways. I'm just going to continue reading here. So there are two ways to live. There are two ways, one of life and one of death. And there is a great difference between the two ways. The way of life is this. First, you shall love God who made you. And second, love your neighbor as yourself. And do not do to another what you would not want done to you. The meaning of these sayings is this. Bless those who curse you and pray for your enemies and fast for those who persecute you. For what reward is there for loving those who love you? Do not the heathens do the same? But you should love those who hate you, and then you shall have no enemies. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Obviously, this should be familiar to anyone who's a Christian for any length of time. Those, of course, are, especially starting in verse 2, direct quotes from Jesus. But as we mentioned in part 1, they do not say, as Jesus said, or, quoth the Lord, or as Jesus has told us, love God who made you and love your neighbor as yourself, and etc. The assumption is that if you're sitting underneath someone's teaching, in order to follow the way of life, you already get that everything that is being said to you is from Christ. It's from Jesus. Because you are signing up to be a follower of Christ. A note here is that in verse 1:1, when it says, there are two ways. One is the way of life, the other is the way of death, and there's a great difference between the two ways. Of course, that is. They don't stop here to reference it, But a Jewish Christian would understand, and most of us who have been Christians for any length of time, who've studied the entire Scriptures, would understand. That's a paraphrase of the idea that there is a way that seems right into a man, but that way leads to death. And Jesus himself talks about there being a narrow way, or a narrow gate and a wide gate. That the one way is hard, but it leads to life, and that's the narrow gate. And the wide gate is easy, but it leads to destruction. So that, again, is sort of a paraphrase of Jesus in Matthew 7, 13 and 14, but without saying so, right? So these are things that, of course, probably would, as you were brought into the community of faith in Christ, you would begin to learn more and more about, this is where these things come from, these are the contexts of these things. But the cool thing, I think, is that by the time you actually have gone through that first section of the Didache, you have been really immersed in the teachings of Jesus, into the way of life, before you've ever even been baptized. So by the time you are baptized and you are welcomed then into the fellowship of the saints, and you begin to partake in fellowship with brothers and sisters in Christ, they will be saying the same things that you've already heard in the beginning of your training. And then you'll recognize, oh my gosh, these are yes, I already know the ways of Jesus. I already understand these ways, the things that Jesus taught, because I've been trained in these things before I was even baptized. I want to also point out here, I'm not going to do this too often, but it is interesting that, where it says in verse 1, there are two ways, and one is of life and one is of death. There's two different words for life in the Greek. One word is bios or bios. That just means existence. And then the other word is zoe, and that means quality of life. Okay, so that's life, not just living, but truly true life, right? Real life. A life of meaning, a life of quality, a life of purpose. And you can guess, of course, that the word life used here in the Didache is zoe. So he would say there are two ways, one of zoe, which is true, not just eternal life. The New Testament quite often will translate the word eternal as in duration. But the word really is zoe, and it just means the quality, the purpose, a life of purpose, a life of meaning, etc. And then the way of death, there are actually two different words for death in the Greek. One word is thanatos, which just means to physically die, to expire. And then nekros, which refers to being dead, as in a corpse. So, of course, thanatos is the word used here, which is the act of dying. So it's sort of the ongoing dying, if you will, rather than past tense, being dead. So there is a way of living, the quality of life of purpose and meaning, a true life. And then there's another way that is the life of dying, a life that is not life, a way that is not life, but a way that is actually dying, a life that is continually being in the process of dying rather than being in the process of living. Okay, and then of course it mentions here that there's a great difference between the two ways, and that just is obvious on one point, but in another way it's saying that nobody will accidentally follow the way of Zoe. Nobody will accidentally slouch, slouch their way or meander their way into the way of life or the way of Zoe. If you want to follow the way of Christ, if you want to follow the way that leads to life, you must intentionally do that. You must seek that out. That will take some effort from you. There's a default way, which everyone follows, which is the way of death. So it takes something a little bit extra to pursue and seek out the way that leads to Zoe, which leads to the quality of the kind of life that is an ongoing life, that is a good life, that has purpose and meaning, etc. Okay, so in other words, if you want to live the way of life, here's how we're going to do this. And then I would also say that Well, he says, verse 2, the way of life is this. First, you shall love God who made you. And second, love your neighbor as yourself. And do not do to another what you would not want done to you. Interesting that when it says here in chapter 1, verse 2, the way of life is this, it begins by saying, first, you shall love God who made you. And then second, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, again, those of us who are Christians who have read the Gospels, we're familiar with this quote and where this quote comes from and why it's worded that way. In other words, why it starts off saying first, love God, and then second, love your neighbor. Why is that? Well, because this comes from a conversation that Jesus had where he commanded you to love your neighbor, and then someone said, well, who's my neighbor? And then he said, well, what is the greatest commandment? And, he says the first one is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he says the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, we don't get that backstory here in the Didache. We just get the phrase, we get the statement, we get the sentence. It's almost like getting somebody grabbing, a soundbite from a movie or from a TV show or something, and you just get that little snippet of the conversation, and then it's over. And again, I would trust that later on, the initiate who continues forward and makes it into the way of life and into the church by following the Didache would be told the context of that story to understand where first and second are coming from. And this first and second, by the way, is going to come up later on. So hopefully we won't forget that. I won't forget to remind you. But keep in mind that chapter 1, verse 2 does this first you shall love God and second love your neighbor as yourself, because that's going to be significant a little bit later on. And also it's significant to me that it says this right after that. It says, and do not do to another what you would not want done to you. Now here's why that is interesting to me, because that is not what Jesus actually said. The way it's phrased in the Didache is in the negative. In other words, it's telling you to not do things to other people that you do not want done to you. It's phrased in the negative. And so really what the emphasis would be by phrasing it that way is you're spending a lot of your time not doing stuff, or just you're holding back from doing things that are bad or negative. So don't do bad things to people. And really all you're doing is you're living in a place of restraint. You're not doing the bad thing because you're remembering, I don't want that bad thing done to me, so I will not do that bad thing to another person. But Jesus didn't phrase it that way. And this is and by the way, there's a Buddhist teaching that is very similar to this. And it's also phrased in this negative way. Not to do things to people that you don't want done to you. But Jesus flips it around. And when we have Jesus in the Gospels, the Gospel writers phrased it in the positive. And Jesus says this, do to others what you would have them do to you. Or treat others as you want to be treated. But see, that's a proactive thing. That's a positive, not a negative, right? Jesus says in Matthew 7:12, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you. It's also quoted in Luke 6:31. Do to others as you would have them do to you. See, now when Jesus says it in the positive, in the Gospels, the emphasis is not on restraining yourself from doing those bad things that are in your heart to do to somebody. No. Jesus is saying, hey, do you love it when people do good things for you? Do you love it when people surprise you with something? Do you love it when people just show up and say, hey, I bought lunch for you. You're hungry? It's on me. Or, would you like a coffee? I'll pay that for you. Or, you know what? I just noticed that your garbage cans need to be taken out, so I just did it for you. Like, those are things that you would love for people to do to you, wouldn't you? I mean, in other words, Jesus invites us to imagine, what are the things that we wish people would do for us? Wouldn't it be awesome if people would just serve us and bless us and do awesome things for us and cool things for us and make us feel good and take things off our shoulders and make life easy for us? Wouldn't we love that? Jesus says, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to start doing those things for other people. All those awesome, beautiful, amazing, incredible things that you wish other people would do for you, I want you to get off your butt and go proactively and do the positive thing. It isn't just don't do the negative thing. It's a proactive, get off the couch, go out of your way, and intentionally go and do something beautiful and good and kind and extravagant for someone else, because you know deep in your heart you wish somebody would do that for you sometime. And notice, by the way, there's no promise that they would do it for you. There's no promise that if you do this to others, they will do it back for you at all. In fact, there's a really good chance they won't. But that's beside the point. Jesus says, do it anyway. So anyway, I find that interesting. And so that's one thing where I kind of wish the Didache would have phrased it the way Jesus phrased it, because the way Jesus says it is so much cooler. But again, maybe this is something that would have gotten, people would have taught them. Maybe since these are people that are pre-baptized Christians, they were still coming out of a pagan society, you begin with baby steps, and you begin by saying, hey, look, the best we can hope for at this point is that you just stop doing bad things to people because you don't like people doing bad things to you. And maybe down the road we'll get to the place where we can flip that around and get you doing positive things, because now you're filled with Christ, you're filled with the love of Christ, you've met him, you know who he is, he's begun to change you and transform your heart. Now we can get busy doing the good things for people that you wish people would do for you. Anyway, moving on, Didache, chapter 1, verse 3. He says this, the meaning of these sayings is this. Now this does get to be the positive. Bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. For what reward is there for loving those who love you? Do not the heathens do the same, but you should love those who hate you, and then you shall have no enemies. Again, this is a total paraphrase from Jesus, from Matthew 6. One of my favorite passages from Jesus, by the way. Again, not attributed to Jesus, but of course we know these are the words of Jesus. And again, now here we do begin to move into this idea. And of course, why I'm excited about this is that as somebody who believes that following Jesus will lead you into a way of proactive love for your enemies and nonviolence, I find this exciting, because here is a document first century Christians were using before they even had the Gospels. And what is chapter 1, verse 3? They jump right into it. Bless those who curse you. Pray for your enemies. Fast for those who persecute you. And then straight into the idea of Jesus, what reward is there for loving those who love you? In other words, there's nothing extravagant. There's nothing special. It's ordinary. It's just ordinary to love people who love you back. The most evil person is capable of loving their own mother, or loving, somebody who shows affection for them. But we are called to something higher, right? We're not heathens, as this says. Don't heathens do that? No, we are followers of Christ. We are followers of the Messiah. We are followers of the one who laid down his life. He loved us so much. And because of that, because of his great love for us, we who have received this great love, we are the recipients of so great a love. We now also stand for a greater standard, higher form of love. And we would love those who hate us. And I love this, that they add this, because if you love those who hate you, then you shall have no enemies. How can someone continue to be your enemy if there's someone you love? And I love that. There was one other thing I was going to say. I was going to point this out. The Didache in this section adds something that Jesus does not add. Jesus just said, bless those who curse you and pray for your enemies. The Didache adds fasting for those who persecute you. So they add a command to fast, which is not found in the commands of Jesus. Now, again, here's a problem for us. Is this, because this document predates the Gospels, is this accurately quoting Jesus? In other words, did Jesus teach, bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you? And then the Gospel writers left it out. And so we have an additional teaching here that wasn't found in the Gospels. Now, I hear a bunch of you saying, hold on, Keith, that's not possible because we know that it's canon, and how could it be wrong? I'm not saying the Gospels are wrong. What I'm actually agreeing with the gospel writers who said that if all the things that Jesus said and did and taught were written down, they would fill all the books of all the libraries in the world. Or that there wouldn't be enough books to contain all the things that Jesus taught. So in other words, we know from the gospel writers that there were things Jesus taught that they did not write down. They wrote down all the ones that at the time they felt were necessary and important. Perhaps the Didache writers included something that the gospel writers didn't include. I just think that's interesting. But we don't know for sure. That's kind of a gray area. Anyway, I find it interesting. Let's go on now. Chapter 1, verse 4. It says, abstain from fleshly and bodily lusts. If someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other also and be perfect. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. If someone takes your cloak, give also your coat. If someone takes from you what is yours, don't ask for it back. And then I love this because up to this point, again, these are very familiar verses to us. These are all commands of Jesus. This is all from the Sermon on the Mount, right? But they add something, of course, which Jesus doesn't add. Which I find awesome, because I know we're only into the 4th verse of the Didache, and you know that they know. It's just almost like the apostles or the disciples who are writing this down, this training manual. They're only into the 4th verse, and it's always they're already stopping to say this: you really cannot. There's this little phrase. So they say, if someone takes your cloak, give also your coat. If someone takes what is yours, don't ask for it back. And then it says, really, you can't. It's like they're almost answering a rhetorical question. They can almost hear the disciple who's hearing this, the thought in his head is saying, really? Wait, seriously? So if someone takes what belongs to me, I can't ask for it back? And they just answer the question, the unasked question, no, you really can't ask for it back. Sorry. No, you can't. If someone takes your cloak, give it to them. If someone takes what belongs to you, you can't ask for it back. No, really, you can't. I just love the no, really, you can't. It's really cool. I don't know if that's meant to be funny or if that's just the emphasis of we're not kidding around. This is absolutely serious. And what I also love about it is that right there at the beginning, we're only into the 4th verse, and they are not pulling the punches, are they? They're not saying, well, let's just kind of ease you into this. No. We are going to hit you in the face with this. This won't be easy. We're just going to give you some of the toughest things that Jesus ever taught right up front, and then we're going to emphasize it by saying, we're not kidding around. This is the way of life. This is the way of Christ. So if you really want to follow, this is it. So then they continue on. Right after they say, if someone takes from you what is yours, don't ask for it back. You really can't. Continues, give to everyone who asks you, and don't ask for it back. So they say it again. Don't ask for it back. The Father wants his blessing shared. I love that. God has blessed you, and if you bless somebody else, don't ask for it back. Keep that thing being shared. Let those blessings continue to flow forward. The idea is not for them to flow back to you. Just let them keep on moving out. Continuing, happy is the giver who lives according to this rule, for that one is guiltless. Now here's a warning. But the receiver must beware. So the one who receives, there's a warning. He says this, but the receiver must beware, for if one receives who has need, he's guiltless. But if one receives not having need, he shall stand trial, answering why he received, and for what use. If he is found guilty, he shall not escape until he pays back the last penny. So there's a warning here, okay? Chapter 1, verse 5 is saying it's all about giving, right? So give to the one that asks, don't ask for it back. The Father wants his blessing shared. The one who gives is happy. If you live by this rule, you will be happy and you will be blameless. But now here comes the warnings. If you receive something from somebody and you were genuinely in need, then no problem. No guilt. No guilt. Don't feel guilty because you received a blessing or don't feel guilty that you needed a blessing. Okay? But if you receive a blessing that you didn't really need, in other words, you just took it because it was free. Oh, hey, here's an extra pair of shoes. Those are nice. Oh, here's an extra coat. Oh, that looks good on me. Now there's a danger you're in, okay? And he phrases it this way: you shall stand trial, answering why you received and for what use. And if he is found guilty, he shall not escape until he pays back the last penny. Now, I don't believe that what it's talking about here is that the early Christian church held trials or put people on trial to say, we're going to bring you before the Christian authorities within the Christian church, and we're going to put you on trial to ask you why you took that. And then if we find you guilty, you will not escape until you pay the last penny. Again, these are quotes from Jesus, right? Jesus talks about, forgiving those who forgive you because you have been forgiven.